Yo, what is up everyone, back here with another video. Today's video we're going to be going over a match that I think was incredible at showcasing one of the probably most terrible Pokemon that's ever been good in VGC, which is Bramblegast, right? So Bramblegast is a really interesting Pokemon. Its ability kind of keeps it meta relevant, and its typing keeps it meta relevant. Even though it's a really underpowered Pokemon in general, it just has some really useful tools that allows it to be just good enough where like you would want to like have it on the team potentially, right? So the interesting thing about Bramblegast mainly is its speed tier, right? Its stab coverage, and then also its ability, which is called Wind Rider, right? So this team that I'm talking about was Emilio Forbes' top 16 team at Worlds, and the reason why it was so close to winning Worlds is it literally just needed 4 more match wins to be able to win the tournament, I believe. So it wins top 16, wins top 8, wins top 4, and then wins finals, right? So yeah, 4 wins. It was 4 wins away from basically winning the Worlds, right? So, and the run ended, so I'm not going to get too deep into the controversy, but basically what happened is there was a kind of issue with the top 16 players where there was a disconnect, and it essentially forced a lot of games to sudden death, and a lot of results that happened might not have happened if like the games had fully played out. So it was kind of a problematic part of the organization there, and like something that resulted in like maybe some inaccurate results. Obviously I'm not speaking to what happened between the two players, because in the end it's a game of Pokemon. There's always outs in certain situations, but to my understanding, from what it was talked about, Emilio did have the game relatively locked. I'm trying to fix the focus on my camera, that's really bothering me. But basically, like, yeah, like Emilio basically said he had it locked. The other player said that there were still outs for him, but like generally, like the game was like more or less sealed, right? Of course, you know, whatever, it doesn't really matter in this instance. But basically, Bramblegast is a Pokemon that is incredibly useful on these kind of teams. So the main reason why it's incredibly useful is because there is essentially like a couple of different ways you can utilize it in like on this team specifically. So you'll notice that you'll have a lot of Pokemon here that are weak to certain other Pokemon in the metagame, right? So for example, one that you could think of would be opposing Tornadus Bleakwind could do a bunch of damage to something like a Urshifu, right? Or it could do a ton of damage to like Flutter, Chi-Yu, like whatever, right? The Wind Rider ability that Bramblegast has access to gives it a lot of helpful immunities. And when I talked to Emilio about Bramblegast and why he was using it, the main reason he brought up, which made a lot of sense to me, was that essentially what he was doing is he was using it as like a Shedinja almost. So if you guys don't know, Shedinja is a Pokemon that's been used in previous formats, using its ability Wonder Guard. And what it essentially does is it gets itself in a position where it's immune to all the attacks in front of it. And then, you know, you take advantage of it to be able to win the game, right? Bramblegast is kind of a similar concept, except it's like literally a better Shedinja in terms of stats. So that's kind of something that makes Bramblegast like really interesting, right? Now, obviously this Pokemon doesn't fit on every team. It's probably in general a really terrible Pokemon. It just happens to have a really good niche in this metagame because of its typing being really good into Urshifu Rapid Strike, and then also just being like a really useful mon with its ability into a couple of different teams, especially opposing Tailwind, right? So that's kind of the main gist of Emilio's team. Is essentially it's a strong Tailwind team that can put on a lot of pressure, and then you also have the benefits of Bramblegast acting as like a defensive pivot that's still really offensive, because obviously it's just an attacker. It just has some good immunities, meaning it can swap into certain attacks, right? So that's kind of the main rundown of the team itself. And another small thing about this team that I think was really interesting is it was a Tailwind team that essentially was like, go, 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 you can't stop me, because there was 1 ghost type, 2 ghost types, 3 ghost types, covert cloak so you can't fake out, and then Chi-Yu, which could Terra Ghost. So essentially it had 5 different ways to block opposing fake outs, and then finally 1 Pokemon that could be faked out. But the thing is like you're basically able to attack every turn that way, right? Like you're not getting stopped by like stuff like fake out. So it was a really unique Tailwind team in that way. They kept the constant pressure on, and I think this team definitely had the potential, especially with how close it was to winning top 8. If it had won in top 8, it had the potential to really make a deeper run in the tournament. Emilio is a phenomenal player. So yeah, it's just like it was a really like interesting team, and like definitely a match I wanted to highlight. So Emilio had played on stream the day before. In this matchup, he's up against Eric Rios. I wanted to showcase this match because this match was the one where Bramblegast was actually used. In the previous matchup that he played on stream, it didn't work because he was against an opposing Chi-Yu that had Dark Pulse, so it was like, I'll just Dark Pulse the Bramblegast, so it's not really great there. And then also, it had a Dark Urshifu, so there were just so many tools that could deal with Bramblegast where it wasn't good. However, in this matchup, it's actually incredibly strong, right? Because Bramblegast, if you look at Eric's team, actually does a lot of work. Now, Eric does have some tools to get around the Bramblegast, but first we'll talk about like why it's good. So basically, Rillaboom can only touch Bramblegast with knockoff if it has it, and Bramblegast can just strength sap it over and over again to beat it in a 1v1. Urshifu loses to Power Whip, it just straight dies, right? You have the Ursaluna, which can't touch it with anything. You have the normal move, but then you also have the ground move. But the ground move that it has, right, which is Headlong Rush, is not really going to be doing too much to the Bramblegast because you can just strength sap it up over and over again, right, to heal, and then you just win with Power Whip. Then you have the Heatran, right? Now, the Heatran does have one tool to hit it, which is Will-O-Wisp, but it doesn't hit it directly. It's more of like a passive tool to kind of stall it out. But it has Heat Wave and Earth Power, which can't touch this Bramblegast. I forget if it was actually Terra Blast or Earth Power. It doesn't matter. Regardless, can't touch Bramblegast. Or like can't touch it for a lot of damage is what I mean. And then finally Flutter, which is actually a good damage answer to Bramblegast, but if you look, like I already mentioned, it's good into these bottom four. So essentially like Emilio has a really good matchup into opposing Tailwind teams that don't have enough respect for Bramblegast, right? So like these four. Now you might be like, okay, but isn't Tornadus also weak to Bramblegast? Eric is running Air Slash, so he actually has a way to hit the Bramblegast on his Tornadus. So at least he has two things that can hit it directly, right? Or at least like for a good chunk of damage. So that's like kind of all the precursor information you need to know. A big swing in this matchup as well is also the Goldango. And the reason why Goldango works so well with Bramblegast is because Goldango typically doesn't want to be eating like Earth Powers or Heat Waves. Bramblegast can perfectly switch into that. And if Eric tries to go for a Will-O-Wisp making a read and Emilio stays in, good as Gold blocks it, right? So essentially Eric's reads are very high risk regardless of what he goes for. So, all right. So we're getting into the match here. Okay, sweet. They're about to get into it. I'm going to see if I can skip it ahead a little bit. There we go. So yeah, so you see the leads here, which is Goldango and Urshifu versus Tornadus, or sorry, Goldango, Tornadus, and Tornadus Urshifu. So Eric's lead is a bit more kind of middle ground here, where essentially he can throw a Surging Strikes into anything, or he can go for a pivoting U-turn, right? Because he's running Scar first, so he can U-turn out, bring in something in the back like a Heatran, right, to absorb the Make It Rain that might be coming out, or like a Shadow Ball Thunderbolt. And essentially, Emilio here has a lot of pressure with his Goldango on the board. If you look at the HP stat, 187 is a really bulky Goldango, so it can actually exert a lot of pressure on the opposing board. So essentially, Emilio here has a better position, at least for this turn, and he's going to be allowed to get a lot of free damage. Whenever you're in a Tailwind mirror, typically both Tornadus have to set Tailwind first, for otherwise they're at risk of like not being able to get their Tailwind up turn 2, especially if one of them has Taunt, right? Essentially what they try to do is set Tailwind and then KO the other Tornadus so the other Tornadus can't Tailwind, and then Tailwind again like later, right? With their own Tornadus if they preserve it. Or you guys trade Tornaduses and then play out of Tailwind as soon as Tailwind expires for both of you, right? The key is really just making sure that you are matching speeds at least, right? Now, because it's Scarf Urshifu, it's not really actively pressuring either of these Pokemon with a KO. The best it can do is get some Surging Strikes chip. For Emilio here, your safest play is probably throwing out like a Make It Rain to pressure both opposing slots. And Eric probably wants to U-turn into his Heatran so he doesn't have to absorb a big Make It Rain on both of these slots. At least that would be my assumption, right? Because in general, you kind of want to sustain damage. And I think that in general, right, like Emilio did lead in a way that puts him in the driver's seat, at least for this game, right? So you're going to see a Tailwind and a Make It Rain come out. We got to see what Eric does here, but generally I would expect Eric to do something a little bit more passive here. Maybe click Tailwind and switch, just so you don't take damage. So yeah, we're going to see Tailwind come out here. Tailwind comes out again, you have to match. Now that you know who set Tailwind first, this means one of two things. This either means that they're speed tying or that Emilio's Torn is faster, which matters for taunt stuff. But I think Eric Rios's Tornadus has Mental Herb anyways, so it's not exactly pressured in the same way that Emilio's would be, where like they both still need to set Tailwind anyways, right? So U-turn comes out here. So, I mean, this is a pretty like straightforward play, right? You have to kind of do this. Now, Keytran comes in, right? Make It Rain comes out here. So this is essentially like a pretty decent turn, right? Goldango didn't exactly like do an insane amount to the Heatran, but I mean, you chunk the Torn, and in this damage trade between the Torns, it's actually really crucial that you don't allow your Torn to kind of go down, like, and leave your opponent's Torn around, or like you make sure that like you at least preserve it enough to set Tailwind in the future. So Eric's in a bit of a tricky position here, right? Like there is some plays that he can do. He can just switch in Urshifu for Torn, and he can just go for Heat Wave here. But this is where Bramblegast is insanely good. So now what Eric has to do, right, because he's forced to play this mind game, right, is am I going to call the Bramblegast coming in or not? If I think the Bramblegast is going to come in, I do one of two things. The first thing that he can do is throw an Air Slash into the Goldango slot and click Heat Wave. That's like your middle ground play that covers for almost anything that Emilio can do, right? So if Goldango stays in, it dies the Heat Wave, right? An Air Slash, or at least it'll take up a good chunk of damage. If Bramblegast switches out, then it takes an Air Slash, but then it'll absorb the Heat Wave. And then if you're hard reading Emilio, then you click Earth Power and you click Air Slash into Goldango. But that's risky because then if Goldango just stays in, you're not getting a good turn, right? So you can see already how many mind games this Bramblegast is creating for the match, right? Like, it's making the game incredibly hard for Eric, and it's forcing him to consider some, like, he has to reconsider his choices a couple times, right? So you're going to see Emilio just decides to hard switch into Bramblegast. It's a pretty safe play that's really hard to punish. And Eric is the kind of player where sometimes he won't make the insane read like immediately. He's going to play safe in the game one. So this is a pretty relatively good spot. You'll see the attack boost comes out. He goes for a taunt into Heatran. So this was a really smart choice by Emilio, because essentially what he's saying is if you are going to KO my if you're going to KO my Bramblegast, you need to make the hard read and go for an Earth Power and an Air Slash into it, right? If you do anything else, you're not getting the guaranteed KO on my slot, right? So what that also covers for is maybe a more middle ground play like Will-O-Wisp into Goldango and switching into Urshifu, which is maybe what he was expecting from Eric, because as I mentioned, he kind of likes to make the safe switches sometimes. So Air Slash comes out, brings Bramblegast down to Sash, right, which is obviously a little bit problematic, but Eric decides to go for Heat Wave, and here's where you're seeing the strength of Bramblegast. Bramblegast now just has a 2+ attack boost just for existing, basically, right? It did take damage on entry, but now it's pressuring a Shadow Sneak into the Tornadus. It's also pressuring a Terra Ghost Terra Blast if it wishes into the Heatran, maybe calling a, switch or protect from the Torn. And it's just a bit of an awkward situation for Eric, right? That being said, it is still like a generally neutral position. Eric is really playing well versus the Bramblegast for what it's worth. Like, he's really respecting it and not allowing it to sit there. His play was kind of that middle ground play I talked about. So right now, in terms of board state and who's really accelerating their position, Eric is in a slightly better position now, only because he's chipped the opposing Torns, so their Torns are equal, and the Bramblegast is down to its Sash, right? So in the damage trade, it's a little bit better. However, that doesn't mean that Emilio can't turn it around. Like, all it takes is one big read here, and it's basically essentially back to neutral. Not to mention that Emilio could just click Bleak Wind here and Terra Ghost Terra Blast and kind of pressure the whole board. Yeah, so you can see he's hovering over Terra Ghost Terra Blast right now, or I guess you can't because my face cam's over it, but he's considering it, right? And that's like the really interesting thing here is like he has a lot of options to pressure the opponent, to where it looks like kind of like tough for Eric. So yep, we're gonna see the Terra Ghost Terra Blast come out here. We might see the Urshifu try and switch in. We'll kind of have to see how it plays out. But essentially what Emilio's saying is I have the pressure here. I'm going to be doing damage, and Bramblegast is going to be able to pressure the opposing Heatran, right? So Bleak Wind comes out and it misses Tornadus. So this is a really like big deal because obviously now the opposing Tornadus gets to survive for another turn. Now the benefit is that you took out Heatran, right? And that's the risk of Bleak Wind Storm to begin with, right? But essentially what happened here is that now the Bramblegast was allowed to get a KO on the Heatran. The problem is because you didn't go for the damage on the, or you didn't connect on the Torn, now the Urshifu in the back is looking a little bit scarier, right? We're assuming Air Slash is just going to come out here and hit the Bramblegast. Yep, and it's going to get the KO. But you can see how Bramblegast is kind of forcing Eric to really have to be careful with how he's playing. It forced the Urshifu out early, and it's also putting him in a bit of an awkward position in some cases, right? Like, if it had connected, it would have put him in a really good spot. Of course, you kind of have to do what you have to do. Okay, so now, right, essentially the board state is that we have to kind of consider like what's going to come back out. It should probably be the Urshifu. It could be the Flutter from Eric as well, which doesn't surprise me too much. Essentially what Emilio has to do here is he has to make sure he doesn't lose too many resources to deal with the Urshifu before the Urshifu comes in. This Flutter is bulky Rocky Helmet with Terra Water in Trick Room. So it's a really like interesting kind of dynamic it has with the rest of the team. In this case, what Emilio probably wants to do is click Dazzling Gleam and click Bleak Wind Storm to maybe try and get chip on both, and then force an awkward position with the Goldango where the Goldango can win. But it's obviously pretty tough because now Eric has really gotten himself into good position off of the miss, right? So we're going to see what happens here. It's probably going to be a Bleak Wind Storm being clicked by Emilio. And then I think it should probably be a Dazzling Gleam because it just makes the most sense. You could also go for Shadow Ball here to try and get the KO in the opposing Flutter, but I think that in general you might want to. I guess he's clicking Moonblast here, which makes sense because if you get the drop, it could be fine. Okay, Protect comes out here. I'm not too sure how much I agree with the Protect, but it's how it goes, you know. Okay, and then the Torn actually survives, so it's pretty rough, right? But the nice thing is that Torn at least was able to survive the turn, so now it puts it in a bit of an awkward spot. The problem here for Emilio really is that like because he didn't KO the Tornadus, right? It essentially made it really awkward because it essentially now can just a Tailwind again, and now the Urshifu in the back is like super, super bad to deal with. So here Emilio probably wants to click something like Tailwind and Shadow Ball into the opposing Flutter, if I had to guess. Because then that way you'd be able to get like enough damage into Flutter, potentially KO it, and then you'd be able to win. At this point, clicking Moonblast into the opposing Flutter could also work. If he's going for that, what he's hoping for is that he's getting in a board state where he can KO the Flutter on its own before the Urshifu comes in. So yep, Tailwind comes out here. He goes for a Gleam. He gets a bunch of chunk damage into the Flutter. Shadow Ball comes out. Eric here is just playing to try and maybe catch the gold on the switch. He kind of thought that maybe like Emilio would want to switch it in, but you know, it's obviously just he wants to preserve his Goldingo in the back. So now the Ursh is obviously problematic because the Ursh can probably just straight up KO the Flutter. And you can kind of see the value how like small turns can add up, right? Like that miss didn't seem like that significant earlier in the game, but the fact that like Tailwind was allowed to get up again now allows this Scarf Urshifu to go crazy. And you'll see that the way Eric had to execute this match was basically, okay, the Bramblegast is really strong in this matchup. I have to get rid of it first, and then I can win the game, right? So that's kind of something that Emilio should definitely leverage going forward. And it's why this Pokemon's so interesting in this matchup, right? It's essentially able to do so well into so much of the team. And like you see the nuance of Air Slash just being able to help. But here with the Terra Water, it's going to do too much to the Flutter main, and it's going to bring down the Flutter in 3 hits. And then Shadow Ball should just be going straight into Goldingo, which isn't super great, obviously. We're going to see Shadow Ball come out. Boom. And then Goldingo barely lives. Throws a Shadow Ball back, but it's too late. And now Emilio is going to be down 1 game. So what are the takeaways from this game, right? So obviously on turn 1, the Goldingo did get a lot of damage off into Tornadus, which was good. What ended up kind of trickling down and making the game a lot harder was when Bleak Windstorm missed, right? So essentially, if you're Emilio, first off, you have to hope that Bleak Windstorm doesn't miss again, but also maybe being a bit more careful about how you're using the Bramblegast, right? Because Eric obviously respected the threat of the Bramblegast existing, right? So maybe being able to play off of your opponent's almost like urge to kind of respect the Bramblegast might be good here, right? So it's a really interesting like position, right? Because him switching in the Bramblegast turn wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was actually a pretty safe play. But he did put himself at risk of like missing, obviously, right? Which is how you have to play because it's just optimal. So that's kind of the really interesting thing that came out of that game. I think in general, Bramblegast is still a really good bring here. I like the idea of Goldingo Torn lead. Now Eric might try and adjust to deal with the the gold lead. So you have to be a little bit careful of that. Maybe consider leading something else this time. Maybe even the Urshifu or leading your Flutter, right? And then having the gold in the back. But we'll kind of see how he goes from here because there's a couple different ways you could go about it after this game. But yeah, I mean, if you're in Eric's shoes as well, you probably feel pretty good about how that game went. Like, you had a little bit of luck with the Bleak Windstorm miss, but generally, like, you were still able to relatively position yourself pretty well. The main thing that you have to be careful with, obviously, is that you are preserving your Flutter and Torn long enough, or at least, like, utilizing them in a way where you can stop the Bramblegast, right? The way Eric dealt with the Bramblegast was kind of masterclass in this situation because he put himself in a spot where he could really, like, stop it. But, of course, there's, there's different ways that it can be played. One different turn could have potentially like ended things for him or like made it like pretty unfortunate, right? So we're going to see how Emilio adjusts here. He might try and alternate his lead a little bit just to cover for Eric's best lead. I could also potentially see Eric, making some adjustments here as well. So what he's bringing. Generally, like you have to consider not only Bramblegast, but like what's around it. So he does lead Urshifu again. So it's actually the same lead. The thing is for Emilio here, right? Is it's pretty much like what do you expect your opponent to do, what do you expect your opponent to do in general, right? So he's kind of expecting the Urshifu to stay in here, I guess. He might also be expecting to like hard switch for here. Like a Make It Rain is still pretty safe. Like a Tailwind Make It Rain is pretty safe. You could also throw out a Thunderbolt as well into Torn to try and get it lower than you got it last time, because a single target Thunderbolt's going to be a little bit stronger than Make It Rain was. So he's kind of picking here, like, okay, like, what do I want to target? What do I want to get damage into? So we're going to see there's going to be a Terra here from the Urshifu. So the Urshifu is going to be immediately going for a Surging Strikes, trying to get as much chip as possible, right? So we're going to see the taunt come out here onto the Torn, and no Tailwind comes out. So Eric didn't have Mental Herb, actually. I misremember that, which is a big deal, right? Because now he's blocking the Tailwind. He's essentially denying him, like, any setup of his Tailwind. So now Emilio's adjusted in a way that's actually really helpful here, right? Because now he can just Tailwind and throw a Thunderbolt into the Urshifu. And it's really awkward for Eric, because now Eric has to play this mind game of, is he going to target my Tornadus or is he going to target my Urshifu, right? And this just puts Emilio in such a commanding position. You can see the difference from game 1 to game 2. Like, Emilio got decent chip in game 1, but in this turn now he's pressuring so hard, and like that Torn just needs like literally a small breath of air to like knock it out, right? So Emilio played this game a lot more efficiently, where he was able to spread damage onto the board like faster. So we're going to see Talon come out here. He threw Thunderbolt into Urshifu, of course, so he was just trying to get the damage. And then Icy Wind from Tornadus comes out here, right? Now, you can see Eric was a little bit fearless here, right? A Bramblegast switch could have been really scary here, because it would have just given a free boost. But he knows that Emilio wants to set up Tailwind, and he knows that Goldango kind of has to pressure the Thunderbolt. But the amount of damage Emilio is kind of getting across the board here is still like not to be underestimated. Like, it's still getting so much done. And here you're just going to see he's going to try and take out the opposing Tornadus, right? So the one thing Eric can do here is maybe throw a Will-O-Wisp into Tornadus if he's expecting something. But you guys see he switches in Flutter here. He just wants to take the Thunderbolt. Heatran's going to go and opt for the safer Protect. Now, if you guys can tell already, this is very, very bad for Eric. Like, Eric has lost so much, essentially, in these past couple turns. Like, he's taken his Torn down to 1 HP, right? He's taken the, like, the Urshifu's full health, but it's, like, not, like, really in a good position. Then you have the Heatran, which has taken a lot of chip, and you have the Flutter, which is in range of Shadow Sneak from Bramblegast. So, essentially, what was done here by Emilio was pretty smart. He just played the Bramblegast way more efficiently. He used the Goldango more efficiently, and essentially set up the board now to where Bramblegast is just such a big problem for Eric, and he really chunked like 2 of the main answers that Eric had to deal with the Bramblegast, right? So this is kind of how you want to use this Pokemon, right? It makes it a lot harder for it to function. He's throwing out a Terra Blast here into the Heatran and considering a Thunderbolt into it. The Heatran slot can protect, so this makes a lot of sense, and Flutter might also want to protect here because it's kind of threatened by the Shadow Sneak. And this is just going to do a lot of damage and kind of put some big pressure on Eric's team, right? And essentially the reason why like Emilio feels okay here is also because he has another slot in the back, so it's pretty relatively fine. We're going to see here that the Tornadus comes in to eat the damage. Emilio goes for the Terra Ghost, Terra Blast, and then we're going to see maybe the Thunderbolt come out as well. Okay, Terra Blast comes out here. And we're going to see that happen. That gets a KO. He's going to go for a Shadow Ball into the Bramblegast. He ignores the Goldango, which obviously is a really big deal here, because now the, Goldango is able to get the Flutter even lower. So this is already a pretty good position for Eric. And now Eric is probably not feeling so great, right? Because now the Bramblegast is faster than the Flutter, which means the Flutter is incredibly bulky, by the way. So this is just putting Emilio in like such a strong position. We can actually double check the Bramblegast speed here just to understand like how slow Eric's was. So if we give it Jolly, okay, so that means, wait, that's kind of insane actually. I didn't realize it was that slow. How slow? Wait, what? Oh my god, Flutter had no speed investment. That's literally like no speed investment Flutter, or they're speed tying, which is kind of nuts because yeah, it essentially had like all bulk. So that's a really bulky Flutter, which is really interesting. But anyways, so yeah, now Emilio, right, he feels pretty good. He can just throw a Shadow Sneak into the Flutter. He can throw out a Terra Blast. Like, he's in a pretty good spot, right? So he chooses to go for a Terra Blast here. There's this double protect. At this point, Eric's trying to kind of scout out what's going on here. But Emilio's already feeling like pretty good, right? Like in this position, you're not exactly worried about like anything that Eric can do. Eric has to kind of stall for the lefties recovery here, but Emilio has just gained so much pressure where like it's very hard for Eric to really find any good significant way to stop it, right? As long as he stops like Trick Room from going up, he's just able to kind of easily take out this Flutter here. So the Rocky Helmet ends up taking out the Bramblegast, and then we're going to see the Thunderbolt come out here and immediately take out the Heatran, right? But what we've... actually, it went for a Will-O-Wisp here. So it was maybe calling the Terra Blast to go into the Flutter. And Emilio felt like it might be a speed tie, so he didn't want to risk it. So Eric covered for that to knock out the Bramblegast. But in that case, he might have been able to click something like Earth Power, or maybe he was calling an Urshifu to come in. That's very interesting, actually. I did not expect them to do that. But anyways, essentially what you guys can see here is that like the Goldango and the Bramblegast just got so much more value in this game, where they were able to really like help Emilio get control of the game faster, right? Goldango kind of spread so much damage, whereas Bramblegast then came in like without like most of its checks being healthy enough to deal with it, and it was able to kind of do that big impact during the mid game to be able to pressure the opposing team. And Heatran was awkward against Bramblegast and Goldango because it's like, okay, I click Heat Wave and then I boost a Bramblegast, or I click Earth Power on Bramblegast and I ignore the Goldango. It just wasn't feeling super great, right, for Eric. I think it might be Terra Blast on Heatran, by the way. Because if he had Earth Power, he should have clicked Earth Power in the Bramblegast, right? So I'm going to assume that's Terra Blast here. That would make the most sense to me. Okay, so Urshifu here is just going to go for Surging Strikes. At this point, like, Emilio has no reason not to just click Surging Strikes into the opposing Heatran. Maybe if he's locking, he can click Close Combat, but he's Mystic Water, so he can just click Surging Strikes and then click Close Combat after. And then at this point, right, Emilio just has a lot of control over the game. You can Tailwind Surging Strikes here so you don't give yourself the defense drop, or you can just Tailwind CC if you want and you don't really care. You're going to see him just click Close Combat here. And then we're going to see the opposing Urshifu just click Surging Strikes. It's going to be 1 Surging Strike, 2 Surging Strikes. It's going to KO Torn, but generally it at least, like, did its job and it got Tailwind up again. And you can see kind of how the late game Tailwind actually matters a lot. So yeah, we're going to see Close Combat come out here, and it's 2 game 3. So now we've essentially seen Eric and Emilio both take heavy control of the games from like kind of the middle of the game. You could kind of tell who was going to win. Emilio really got so much damage in turn 1 and turn 2 that you could kind of tell that he was primed to really take the game immediately. And in game 1, you could tell that Eric had stalled out Emilio's options enough, and like he had been able to reposition well enough where like essentially Emilio did not have the tools to deal with Eric's board later. So from both players' perspectives now, you're considering, okay, like Emilio knows his Bramblegast is really good, so it's like I need to bring it, right? And Goldango is obviously really key in this matchup, and so is Torn. What do I want to do with my last slot? Urshifu was good as long as it was positioned. I think Urshifu is still really strong because it lets you deal with the opposing Ursaluna. The only thing that Urshifu has to be really careful with is the opposing Flutter, because the opposing Flutter is running Rocky Helmet and Terra Water, right? But if you can position your Urshifu late game with the Bramblegast, it can do a lot of damage into this team, like, at the end. So now we're going to see both players obviously considering, like what they're going to do as their options. I'm going to move ahead a little bit. All right, so they're going to get into the match now. We're going to see Tornadus and Flutter as a lead, and we're going to see Urshifu and Tornadus. So both of them chose to make the adjustment. So this is actually insanely risky from Emilio's perspective, because your gold game plan worked so well in game 1 and game 2 when you played it properly, right? So essentially what Eric says is, I know that you are not going to lead Goldango here because you want to make an adjustment that's going to catch me off guard, or at least force a worse trade for me. Because essentially what Emilio could do if he really wanted to here is lead Urshifu Torn just like Eric will, and click Tailwind and Terra Water Surging Strikes and immediately pin into the Tornado slot. Or what he can do, right, is he can, like if he leads Goldango, then like it's a little bit worse for Eric, right? But Eric is basically counting on Emilio leading the Urshifu, and he makes a really good call out here because Emilio now is in a really dire position, right? Like you don't want this lead versus the opposing team, and you can't safely go for like taunt because then you could get air slash moon blasted, right? So you're kind of in a position where like you want to maybe be clicking something like the Tailwind and attack, right? But it's still really interesting here because you could also potentially see a Trick Room come out from Eric. He's essentially forcing both means of speed control as like a thought in Eric's head. So what Emilio has to do here is he kind of has to call properly which target is going into it, or like what's being targeted into, and then also like how he's going to play from like turn 2. So he opts to go for a taunt here into the opposing Tornadus, and then he brings in Goldango. Let's see what happens here. He goes for Sunny Day, and Flutter goes for Shadow Ball, and we're going to see Goldango survive. So what Eric essentially tried to do here is he basically said, okay, I know that you are going to try and bring in Goldango here, so I'm going to make the hard call out and click Shadow Ball. And also, the Sunny Day play still works, because if Emilio clicks Terra Water Surging Strikes, or even regular Surging Strikes in the Flutter, in Sun, it's not going to be doing as much, and Emilio's taking like 50% on his Urshifu, right? So it's pretty rough, and then he just gets KO'd by Shadow Ball. Now, essentially, the main thing that was like a problematic part of that plan for Eric would only be if Emilio specifically called out what he was doing and just went for a taunt into Tornadus and a Terra Water Surging Strikes into Tornadus. That would have totally changed the momentum of this game and made it like way tougher for Eric. But luckily he kind of gets a really good value turn. This is still scary for Emilio, because even though you have Make It Rain pressure on both of these slots, Flutter can Terra Water here and just click Trick Room. So then you have to pick, if it's going to Trick Room, you go for a taunt into the opposing Flutter, and then you go for like maybe a Make It Rain, but even then Torn goes first and knocks your Goldango out, right? So it's a pretty rough position, because now the Goldango is just in range of both attacks. So it's in a really tricky situation. Like, I don't actually think Eric could be punished here for clicking Air Slash into Goldango and then clicking you Trick Room with Flutter, right? So it's really tough for Emilio here, because he has to make a big value choice, and like he has to kind of give up something this turn. So Eric made a phenomenal play turn one, being able to pressure Goldango, right? And this is obviously problematic for the Bramblegast in the back, because the Bramblegast is really capitalizing when like these two Pokemon in front of it, or that are on the board right now, are gone. So because they're getting so much value and they're still around, that means that Bramblegast might be forced to come out and play before these Pokemon are out of commission. So we're actually going to see Tornadus switches out here, and we're going to see Ursaluna come in, and we're going to see the Terra Water come out from the Flutter, and we're going to see, you know, obviously, let's try and set up Trick Room for its partner, right? So here, Emilio actually makes a really devastating, like, misread. I don't know if it's misread or, like, bad call, but basically he says, okay, I don't think you're going the Trick Room. I think you're going to go for the attack route, so I'm going to Tailwind, right? Now, this is pretty rough, because essentially what you just did here is you gave Ursaluna, like, some free reign to just kind of run through the game. And now, even though the Make It Rain chips the Ursaluna, your entire board is so pressured by the opposing Flutter and Ursaluna, right? So Trick Room goes up here on the Flutter, but it's already like a really bad situation, right? Because now it's essentially just saying, okay, I really hope I can like withstand all this damage coming out from Eric, right? So what Emilio has to do here is he has to try and find a way to reposition out of the way. But this is already like kind of one of those situations where I mentioned, like, in these matchups, it feels like the game is decided by like turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. And this is kind of where you're seeing the tipping point. Whereas if Emilio has a bad turn here, you're probably going to see the end of the game happen, right? Because it's just not like a good position for Emilio right now, and Eric has to make some big mistakes. If you're Eric, you can probably just click something like Headlong Rush into Goldango and just click something like Moonblast into the opposing Tornadus, to just give yourself some value. And like, I think Emilio is just counting on him, like, not recognizing that. Yep. So he's just going to throw a Headlong Rush out. Maybe he throws out a Shadow Ball. You can also throw out Shadow Ball here as well. Yep, we're going to see Shadow Ball come out here. And this is the one problem with Bramblegast, right? And this is where you can see its weaknesses are being a bit exploited. Bramblegast is not a good defensive pivot, right? So essentially, like, what Eric did here is he kind of masterfully played, where, like, essentially what you did is you forced the mind game of, like, the Tailwind versus the Trick Room, right? And then you get the Trick Room up and you get the Ursaluna. And so he executed his game plan here really well. And this is pretty rough now for the for Emilio's side, right? Because there's just so much pressure coming out from this Ursaluna. There's not enough burn chip going around to actually pressure it. And even though he can pressure with an Aqua Jet here, right, it's still a little bit awkward because the Flutter actually underspeeds. We saw in the previous game that Bramblegast actually was outsped by the opposing Flutter, right? So it's like, how do you stop that from happening? And Tailwind's already up as well, so it's even worse, right? So I think there's a couple of things that now Emilio can consider here, right? You can throw an Aqua Jet into the Ursaluna, and you can throw a... You have to Terra Water Aqua Jet, by the way. And you throw a Shadow Sneak into the Ursaluna, because that covers for if there's a switch, right? And then you will get the chip redirected into Flutter if, you know, it just goes down, if the Ursaluna goes down. And then you would have to bank on the Urshifu having enough in the tank to be able to deal with the remaining Pokemon in the back. Now, the problem is we know that Eric's most likely back is going to be that Urshifu that he brought the last time. So that's going to be something that really has to be considered in this endgame here. So it's looking pretty rough for Emilio here, but you can see kind of like it's really interesting, right? Because Bramblegast still gives some interesting ways to do it. And by the way, when you see Rillaboom here, that's like probably really devastating for Emilio because like that was the one Pokemon you couldn't see in the back. So it was actually an incredibly good adjustment from Eric and makes a lot of sense in this case. So the problem was here was a couple of things, right? So now that Rillaboom's in, it's essentially able to just like fake out into Urshifu and like Flutter can just attack Torn again. But you really see the interesting parts of like Bramblegast on a team like this, right? Bramblegast is actually a really strong Pokemon in concept. We saw it executed really well in game 2, right? But this also showcases some of the weaknesses of Bramblegast. As soon as it's out of position or the main tools that it was designed to beat, right, are in a better position in terms of like how they were utilized, and the main checks to it were positioned a bit better, it basically allowed for Eric to be able to just exploit the fact that Bramblegast needs, like, it's a single target Mon. There's just too many Pokemon for it to deal with to win here, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing that got exploited in this case, because regardless of what Emilio does, there is no way for him to kill this Flutter without like losing some kind of value, right? Like he would lose his Bramblegast. So he's basically playing on misplays, but what's really interesting about Emilio's team was it was very all or nothing. If you get the reads wrong, if you get the plays wrong, you lose, like you lose the game essentially on like turn 2, turn 3, right? So that was a really interesting part of this. And then we see Moonblast come out here, it hits Tornadus. The recovery comes out. All right, and then we're going to see at this point, like, he just has to hope that, like, Eric will make a mistake, right? At this point, Eric, all he has to do is click Moonblast into Tornadus, right? And it should just take it out. There you go. So, like, this is essentially Eric being like, okay, like, now I just win the game. Like, I just need to not click the wrong buttons. Now, you'll see kind of the issue that occurred with the team choice here, which was if Goldingo had been led instead of Urshifu, right? It might have been a much better position for Emilio, because then he could have just thrown out like a Terra Steel, make it rain immediately, chunked a ton on whatever came in, and it would have been like incredibly devastating for Eric, right? But because there was just so much being done by the opposing, by the opposing side against the Urshifu, and the Urshifu was led, it just made the game like incredibly rough, right? So you can definitely see that, like, I don't think it was a Bramblegast problem. I just think it was like the lead issue factored in with the fact that Bramblegast wasn't able to be utilized properly in this game. So this is kind of what makes it a really interesting Pokemon, right? It's like, it's good, but it's not good enough where like it can bring games back like this, right? It's a game that it's like a Mon that you set up and then can win with like the momentum that your other partners provide, but it can't really win a game on its own. As long as the opponent has proper tools to deal with it, right? So that's kind of the really interesting thing here. So at this point, right, we just see, Flutter obviously knock out the Tornadus, which is pretty good for Eric. He's probably feeling really good about how his turns went. And at this point, right, Bramblegast unfortunately is going to get walled by the Rocky Helmet. I mean, at this point, you have to like pray, right? He's going for another Protect here, hoping that, some miracle happens. But at this point, it's just going to be a Wood Hammer come out, and then you're just going to see the Flutter be able to throw a Moonblast out, and that should wrap up the game. So this kind of brings up a really interesting question, right? So we watched this game. Oh, by the way, they speed tie because Bramblegast went first here. So that might have been something Emilio needed to play for earlier, but he just learned this information in game 3. So there, you can't like fault him for that. But this brings up the really interesting question, which is Bramblegast a good Pokemon, right? And how close was it to actually winning Worlds? I actually think that this Pokemon was probably one of the best parts of the team, right? The problem with the team overall was just that, or I don't know if it's a problem, it's just the choice that you make with this team is that your turn 1, turn 2s, turn 3s are going to basically shape up the entire game. So it's a really good Pokemon if you can utilize your partners properly and set it up properly, but it's really weak at bringing back kind of games that have fallen behind through a bad turn 1, turn 2, right? And that's essentially like, I guess it speaks to like where it fits the best. So Bramblegast is normally an F tier Pokemon. You do not put this Pokemon on a balanced team. You don't put this Pokemon on a team where it's just going to be sitting there. I'm going to fix this. I hate the focus messing up consistently. Yeah, so it's not a Pokemon that you'll put on like any team or like a balanced team. It's a Pokemon that you'll put in an offensive team, capitalizing off of the opponent's misplays, and it's really a Pokemon that creates like extra mind games in certain situations. I hope you guys found this video interesting. I just thought the match was really cool, and I thought the Pokemon was really cool, especially with how close it was to winning, and also just, you know, that set in general is just a really cool set. So hopefully you guys, you know, have a greater appreciation for the Bramblegast. If I were to tell you what I think about it, I definitely think it is a Pokemon that works with these kind of teams, but it's interesting because it only really works with these kind of teams, right? So you can see the strengths and weaknesses of it from that specific game, right? But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to let me know in the comments what kind of, you know, Pokemon matches, whatever you'd like to see me talk about next. And hopefully, you know, this was informative for you guys. If you guys would like to support me beyond here, make sure to check out the Patreon. Make sure to check out, you know, all the other links down below. Make sure to check out my socials, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Peace.